All right, everybody, we're going to get started with the Q&A. You can find your seats. A lot of wisdom up here, and we're looking forward to hearing some of their experiences and ways that we can glean off of that. So we'll just start off with this question, which has been asked. I know the past couple years we've heard the term theonomy a lot. I don't know who wants to take this, or you can share it around, but what is theonomy? And how does that influence our understanding of wisdom and influencing culture?
Sure. Theonomy is a theological term that kind of essentially, I would define it this way. I would consider myself theonomic. It's in terms of my theology. I would say theonomy is just the belief in the abiding validity of God's law. So there's different ways of applying that, but I think you said that we've heard about this a lot over the last couple of years. I would say that there's a lot of people who looked at the stances of the churches that are all represented here and use the term theonomy pejoratively, like it's a bad thing, as if it's through legal means, through changing the legislation here in Canada or through getting the right person voted, that there's some sort of top-down forced Christianity. I think that's a straw man of theonomy. I think theonomy simply believes in the abiding validity of God's law, that God's law and the principles embedded within it have something to say about all areas of life. So Jonathan said it well when he just said God's law influences every realm of life: economics, education, healthcare, welfare, everything. God's law is the basis. God's law provides the foundational wisdom for how we ought to walk wisely in all of those spheres.
Yeah, so the word itself, theonomos, God, law. So that's the definition of the word. And we also bring in this idea of sphere sovereignty. So that's a quick overview of sphere sovereignty, is that there are spheres of authority. So God is the ultimate authority. He's King of Kings and Lord of Lords, but he delegates authority to different spheres of life. Think of circles. Circles have an outer limit to them. So a husband has authority over his wife, but it's not absolute. Parents have authority over their children, but it's not absolute. Elders have authority over their church, but it's not absolute. Governing officials have authority over nation states, but it's not absolute. They're always boundaried by God's laws. They can't play the role of God. They can't be God. They can't become tyrants. Their authority is limited. It's real authority, but it's limited authority. So then, if any of those spheres are looking for the laws of God that apply to their area of business, they look to God's laws for direction. So a husband, Christian or not, should function in keeping with God's law and will be held accountable for that. The state should function in keeping with God's law. So, for example, the state doesn't have the authority to determine that men can marry men and women can marry women. That's beyond the boundaries of the authority that's been granted to them by God. The state does not have the authority to open and close churches, to control the ministry and worship of the Christian church. That's beyond God, that's beyond the laws and authority that God has given to them. The state doesn't have the authority to educate your children or care for your health. That's beyond the limits of their job description. So the reason why I'm emphasizing that is a lot of people think, okay, what do you mean by theonomy in culture? Well, it simply means that in every one of those spheres, they should be governed by the foundational laws of God. It's not about forcing people to be Christians, forcing people to go to church, because, for example, those would be ecclesiastical laws that relate to the church life. They don't relate to the public realm. As Nate mentioned, a lot of people have this notion, theonomists, that means they're trying to force everybody to be Christians. That means they're trying to save the world through by moralizing people, or that means they want a national church. It's not true at all. I've never heard any theonomists say that. But that God's laws apply to all of life. What's the opposite of God's laws? Man's laws. So if you're not theonomic, you're anthroponomic. It means that your laws are based upon men. That's where you flip the creator-creature distinction, and the creature takes the top position and God takes the bottom position. And now you're governed by man's laws. So that's a basic definition and description of how a theonomic worldview fleshes itself out in culture.
Nice. I don't know if you want to add to that or sufficient.
I think practically for Canadians, the reason why this was a controversy in some circles is there's two reasons. There's one that's a legitimate question, and the second one is really a cover for sin. And so the first legitimate question is, what do you mean by God's law? So every Christian tradition, to some degree, recognizes that the way that we interpret, say, the Mosaic covenant in relationship to the Christian and to civil life as a Canadian, there's some interpretation involved. And so some sincere people want to know, what do you mean? Because when they hear the word law, they think just Deuteronomy. And what you're proposing is a one-for-one correspondence with the way the Israelite nation governed themselves and the way that we're proposing for Canadians to govern themselves. Within the theonomic camp, I would say, men who would have theonomic impulses, there's differences on how we would answer that question, the way that we would apply those principles, etc. And that's a fair and reasonable conversation to have, and I think a good conversation to have. But I think the fake outrage, particularly from some pastors over theonomy, is not really to do with that, because no one's really advocating for some radical and extreme application of the Mosaic law to Canadian culture, one-for-one correspondence. As someone who's rolled in these circles now, I mean, I've read Joe's book, this is kind of the text on this, talked to all these guys. No one's advocated for that. So it was kind of a straw man that was happening, which brings me to the second part. Is I think a lot of this is, there's this idea in Canadian culture that not only should there be the separation of church and state, which we would affirm regarding sphere of sovereignty, there should be the separation of God and state. And so when you bring up the idea that God alone has authority over all of humanity, over all of every sphere of human existence, whether it's the family, the individual, the magistrate, whoever, people start to get the willies over that. And they start to feel very uncomfortable. And the contention which we had, and which I believe we share, is that Christ is not only Lord of the church, but he's Lord over all. And that his word should come to bear on all. And we've grown up in this secular myth that Christianity is a private thing and a private belief, and Jesus is a private Lord. But there's no such thing as a private Lord. He's the Lord of all, or he's not Lord of all. Yeah. And so I think really when push came to shove, a lot of us realized that, hey, we hadn't thought about how Christ, at least I'll speak for myself, I hadn't given enough thought how the word of God comes to bear in the civil realm. And then I realized that it did, and it didn't matter whether Caesar liked that. It was completely irrelevant whether the health unit or whether our mayor or whether our prime minister agreed with Jesus. It actually is completely irrelevant. And I think that that's a paradigm shift for a lot of Christians. And a lot of pastors, rather than putting their time into thinking about these issues and how we should do it, started attacking people who are trying to apply them. Because what it does is it brings a burden of responsibility. If our contention is that the word of God is over our mayor, over the health unit, over our prime minister, that's going to bring the ire of those authorities as well. So really, I think that's, in my view, what's going on.
Yeah, that's great. I got one for John, or Mr. Wellham. You listed a few different things in your talk about what Christians should look for in businesses, avoiding ETFs, obviously doing more research. Your company would likely do a lot more research than the average person would in where to invest. But how much should we as young Christians expect to research when looking for places or things to invest in? Should we just say, you know what, let's just save a lot of money and go to your company one day? Or should we just say, with the little that we have, with our $20 bill, do we do our hour, 2 hours, 10 hours? How should we?
Well, I mean, I think that the answer to that's going to depend on the person and their aptitudes, their interests, their time. Much of the research can be done by individuals if they have a strong interest in finance and economics and they're prepared to do the reading. My encouragement would be, if you go that route, make sure you do due diligence and you do the work and you understand what you're doing. The Bible makes it clear. Again, you should be operating with wisdom and a base of knowledge, not just speculating. The less you know, the more you're speculating. And so I think that if you're going to do it on your own, and there's many people who are very confident to do that, build networks, run ideas past people, and you can do the research and probably take care of your finances. I think that's by and large a rather small subset of people, though, because people are very busy. And then the encouragement would be to find a financial advisor, financial firm that would align with your interests. So I'm not shamelessly promoting Rocklink per se, but but that's what we've tried to do at Rocklink is. We do have they're all Christians, they're all committed individuals to Christ, and they're very smart, and we're trying to operate as prudently as possible. So it is something that people, I was talking to someone afterwards, I do think that every person should develop a basic understanding of economics and finance so that you're not fooled and you have an overview of how things work. It doesn't have to be detailed. Get some basic books, read. That is important. And then there are some that can do it on their own, but generally look for professionals with alignment of values.
Okay. And one follow-up while we're on that, just to get a better understanding so you don't end up with 360 calls on Monday morning, what should we know about, obviously, a Christian company like yours? We hear your beliefs. We think that's great. I align with that. Should the average person be calling into your type of institution, or should we be looking for different Christian businesses until we've kind of built a little more of a foundation? Or tell us a little bit about Rocklink and like in the personal aspect of it to young, lower income.
It's very important to have a discipline in saving and a budget. Very, very important. And I know that these three pastors would tell you that because they're dealing with people in the church, and problems will emerge if you don't have a budget. If husband and wife don't agree on spending, it's going to be a major, major issue. It causes all sorts of problems. And it's very important also to compound. So you start with a little bit and you just have the discipline to set aside money on a regular basis, and the Lord will provide. I'd also add that you should also be a very good giver. Again, we don't believe because you give, God gives you more per se, but that's obedience, and God's faithful. And so good stewardship of your money and providing and giving money to the church and having a tithe, I think is critical early on. Even when you don't have much money, build that discipline, and God will bless it. He's the one that controls all the circumstances around you and all the events, and that's critical too. So I would say start saving. You can talk to us, phone us. We do have some minimums because we can't deal with everybody, but we can also point you in certain directions and give you some understanding just to get things going, get the ball rolling where you can, some common sense ideas.
Yeah, that's great. And then is there any maybe wisdom that you guys have learned over the years in terms of finances as to things that have helped you maybe save and obviously being in pastoral ministry, you're likely not making huge money, especially if you're risking fines and whatnot. So what have you learned or gleaned from others that you found helpful?
Yeah, I'll answer that because I'm the wealthiest of the three. The Bible says, he who gathers money little by little sees it grow. And there again, we have playing the long game. So I remember when I went through many, many years of education, you're paying tuition, you're not generating income. You see your buddies go off to university, earn shorter degrees, and get out in the work field. They're making twice as much money, and you're like, I want to serve Jesus, but they're pulling ahead of me. But for the most part, I've pulled way ahead of them now because many of them weren't operating from a Christian worldview. They weren't actually budgeting their money. They weren't actually giving to the church. They were taking it for granted. So when my wife and I were first married, we sat down with a Christian financial advisor, and he just told us basic stuff, budgeting, tithing, giving. I'm thinking, what on earth? How is it that I made it through 22 years of life and no one told me this stuff? And the light went on, and we disciplined ourselves. And we disciplined ourselves for years and years and years because we had 5 kids in 6.5 years. They were very expensive to feed and clothe. We were sending them to a Christian school. We did get some help with that, but we were paying some tuition. And then we were planting a church, so I took a salary cut to plant the church, and it was tight. Like I would never drive through the Tim Hortons drive-through. At the time, I think a medium coffee was $1.10. I would never do that without budgeting it. I just didn't have the flexibility. That was my normal. So we budgeted it out. We made sure at the top of our budget, our givings tithes, offerings, and alms. Those were laid out. And then an order of priorities, all our other expenses. And we just stuck to that plan year after year after year after year. And eventually you get to a point where you're like, actually, the kids are all in school now. My wife can go back to work part-time. Or the house is starting to get paid off. We paid off our first house, and then we were able to buy another house and invest in that. And now we're at a point where I'll be 50 years old next month. We have lots of flexibility. But again, it's he who gathers money little by little sees it grow. If you're 25 years old, you shouldn't be living like I'm living. Okay, you should be living basically paycheck to paycheck, very careful, very frugal, saving up a down payment, paying off student loans if you have it. Be ruthless with that, ruthless with debt. One more story. I was not told it was a bad idea to get student debt. But I told all my kids, because I knew better by the time they were going to school, don't go into debt to go to school. But we had gone into some debt to go to school, and then I married my wife, and at one point in our dating process, I'm like, hey, how much student debt do you have? And she told me, and it was right around the same amount that I had, but I did the math, and I thought, uh-oh, I never thought about that when I took out my debt. Then now it's doubled. And then we had a car loan. So coming into our young married years, we had 2 student loans. We wanted to save up for a house. We had car debt. So we were absolutely ruthless with paying that off. I think we paid it off in 2 years. The way we did that is we lived 100% of my little salary. We took 100% of her salary, and this was before online banking. And I would make probably 3 to 4 trips to the bank every single week. Like if I had $100 or $150, I wouldn't wait till Friday. I'd drive right to the bank. I'd walk in, I'd make an extra payment on our student loans, or I'd make an extra payment on our car. So we were able to pay all that off, and then that opened the door for us to purchase our first home and start to have kids. So one of the things that a lot of young people don't think about, they're like, oh, I want to have a family. Okay, but you have $100,000 in debt. How's that going to work? And then if you marry someone with $100,000 in debt, how's that going to work? So make sure you're thinking in advance about the decisions, the implications of the decisions that you're making upon your future spouse, your future career choices, your desire to buy a house, etc. And on the top of it, no matter how much debt you have to give God your first fruits. You have to give God your first fruits, and you'll be blessed for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good there.
Yeah, honestly, that's all great. I wouldn't add anything to that in terms of financial stuff. The one thing I would add just in terms of stewarding your resources well is we live in a world where increasingly specialization has made all of us less knowledgeable about general things. I think I'll talk particularly to the men. Try to be a man with range. I grew up with a dad who was not handy at all. I just grew up in a family that always outsourced if we needed plumbing, if we needed electrical work, if we needed whatever. And so I would just say one of the things that I've consciously tried to do, becoming a guy in my early 20s who knew absolutely nothing other than I didn't know, what a Robertson screwdriver was for. And so just figuring out how to do a lot of that work yourself. If you don't know how to rotate your own tires and do your own oil changes and do a little bit of, there's actually a young man from my church here who's a plumber in the church, and I'd pay him to come over and say, I know it's going to take you twice the amount of time and I'll pay you for that, but I'm going to ask you questions while you do all this so that next time I can do it myself. And so honestly, I think that sort of stuff in terms of figuring out how to be a little bit more self-sufficient, and this goes in everything that Jonathan was talking about in terms of unplugging from the system, but learning to be a man with range who can both be a blessing to other people, but also it just helps you steward your own resources well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. I feel like you're the fourth one. Yeah, okay. Then you can start us off with the next question if you'd like, I guess. This is more on the relationship side. We've gotten a lot of questions about that. We're also not going to be able to get to every question. There's been a bunch sent in, so we're going to stick to ones that seem repetitive or most beneficial for our time. This question is, should you break up with someone who is struggling with pornography? And I would assume it means pornography addiction. In that, how should you handle that situation if you're dating someone that's still struggling with this? Should you end it? How would that work?
I think potentially. I think that it's become so ubiquitous that the kind of standard we have now, that it is an inevitability. And I think that we need to start with it is not an inevitability, or should not be an inevitability, that our spouse and partner or future partner will struggle with pornography. And I think once we do that, then we'd have to put the things in place to avoid that. We'd have to be much more serious. I think a lot of people think it's insane to not have a smartphone. It's not insane to not have a smartphone. It's inconvenient in ways. But if that's what helps you to resist that temptation, to avoid it, the father tells his son in Proverbs, don't go down to her house. Don't go to the shady lady's house. Like, why? If you don't want to end up in your bed, don't walk by her street. Don't go by her house. And if you find that, your phone is a good example, that you just keep looking at garbage on your phone, get rid of your phone. I wouldn't say a hard, fast rule that, if a guy, for example, and women struggle with this too now, actually, that if one of the people in a relationship just, finds themselves looking at something, that this isn't a pattern, it's a one-off thing, they've been walking in purity for a long time now, they confess it to you, I don't think it's an automatic, you're done, I'm not going to be with you. Because I think that on the flip side, we need to be characterized by repentance. And I think a confession of sin is an encouraging thing. I think that men, if it's you have to be prepared for that consequence. And just prepared that if a woman doesn't trust you because of that, that's perfectly legitimate. If she says, look, I respect you that you came clean about this as a Christian man. I just want you to demonstrate some time of faithfulness with this when we're not deciding whether we're going to get married. That's perfectly legitimate too. So I don't think I'm not going to say with like every circumstance, absolutely. But I would say that there's some serious conversations to be had for sure.
Yeah, it's good. And
if I could just add to that, struggle is a euphemism for sin. And there's sin that's being confessed, and there's sins that's being committed that's not being confessed. So, was the person busted? When they say struggle, does it mean, every 6 months they look at something and then turn away? Does it mean they're looking at kiddie porn every day? Bestiality, some sort of extreme perversion? I mean, there's a lot of variations as to what this actually means, struggling with pornography. So pornography fundamentally is grounded in lust, right? That's the sin behind the sin. And I doubt there's very many red-blooded men or women who can say, I made it all the way to my marriage night and I never lusted. I doubt there's very many. But if it's taken you captive, if it's part of your lifestyle, it's something that is a habit, you need to throttle back in that relationship, in my view, and deal with it. And one of the consequences of participating in pornographic use is you start to disqualify yourself from long-term meaningful relationships. So in that respect, it incentivizes purity when there's consequences to impurity. And one of the consequences to impurity is that relationships start to suffer and fall apart. Because I can guarantee you, no man and no woman that loves the Lord is going to want to crawl into bed with their spouse on their wedding night, knowing that they're in the process of viewing pornography. It's not going to work. So we have to kind of define what struggle means, what the degree is. Are they in the process of they're saying, it's a temptation for me. Occasionally I've looked, but I don't give into it. I generally have self-control. I generally have conquered it. Or, I view pornography every day, and sometimes some pretty grotesque and perverted sorts of, pornography. So there's some wisdom and some different considerations that also need to be thrown into the mix there as well.
And kind of on the similar idea, if you're dating someone and you've found out that you were planning on remaining pure till marriage and you find out that in their past that's not part of it, is that a legitimate reason to say, you know what, I cannot continue this relationship? Or in a fallen world, is it just, maybe that's something you need to work through and be okay with? Is it a legitimate reason to end a relationship because someone is not a virgin?
So this is a legitimate question. It's not a theoretical question. Mm-hmm. It's a legitimate question that many people, unfortunately, throughout history, I'm sure, have been confronted with. I've advised the young men that I disciple to ask that question earlier in the relationship rather than later in the relationship. I'm not talking about date number 1, but probably by date number 3 or 4, there needs to be, hey, and you shouldn't really have to ask. It would be better for you to say, hey, you know what, I just want to let you know that I'm enjoying our time together. Who knows where this relationship is going to lead. But full disclosure, I kind of need to let you know about a few things. And then, you would perhaps say something like, it's under the blood. I've asked God for forgiveness for it, but I did sleep with a previous boyfriend or previous girlfriend. And I just want you to know that right up front. I'm embarrassed by it. I'm ashamed. I've confessed it. I know it's not my identity, but in fairness to you, because I don't know where this relationship's going to lead, I just want you to know that. That's an honorable thing to do. And then having received that, so let's say there's a virgin dating a non-virgin, then that person needs to make a decision. And in some respects, I think we would all understand, it's not about misunderstanding the gospel. Okay, we know we can be forgiven of any and every sin that any other human being has ever committed in human history. Every sin can be forgiven by the precious blood of the Lord Jesus Christ, including murder, including rape, including adultery. It's not about that. But maybe if we took it up to a bit more of an extreme level, I remember many, many years ago, there was a man that I knew that in his pre-Christian days had molested his 2 teenage daughters. Several years went by, that relationship was broken off, and he got saved. He then got busted. He turned himself in. He did jail time, came out of jail, and he got remarried. In the process of being remarried, this is many years after he'd committed that very despicable sin, he disclosed this to his fiancée because he wanted to make sure that she was comfortable marrying him given his past, and she did. But I can guarantee you, if we had a show of hands here, there'd be many people in this room that might say, you know what, I get it, it's under the blood, but that's not the kind of relationship I could have. I just could not marry a man, whether it's 10 years ago or 20 years ago, whether it's as a Christian or non-Christian, that molested his daughters. It just wouldn't work for me because marriage is a sexual union. And I just don't think I could put that out of my head. And that's fine. That's fine. You need to kind of sort through that yourself. But I do encourage couples to, bring that conversation up earlier on and then allow the person out or, allow the person to say, you know what, I can handle that. What wouldn't be fair, what would not be fair, and I've seen this happen, is for you to say, I'm okay with that, and then a year in, you're not okay with that. Then you've invested a year, you've led this person on, and then suddenly it's like, yeah, I'm really not okay, I'm uncomfortable with that, we got to break up. I've seen that happen too, and I don't think that's fair, and I don't think it's truthful. So that would be my advice to young couples in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with all that. I thought that was really wise advice, and I would just say that there's, this is one of the reasons why, as so many young people, and Aaron may have just talked to you if you've been involved in sexual sin in the past, but let this be a warning to those of you who maybe haven't ventured there. Sexual sin, all sin has repercussions, and there can be forgiveness, and there is forgiveness in Christ, but that doesn't mean that you are absolved of the consequences of your sin. And so if one of the consequences of your sexual sin means that a relationship, there's somebody that you're interested in who's now no longer interested in you, that's part of the cross that you bear because of the sins of your past. So I simply say that to say, and I've seen it too in terms of there's been redemption, there's been all kinds of beautiful testimonies, but I would just say for those of you who are young, this ought to be one of the motivating factors that keeps you pure, that keeps you out of people's beds and keeps you off pornographic websites. Because, and let me just also say this, I think sometimes as young people who struggle with lust, there are, particularly with young men who believe that when they get married, that's going to solve their porn problem. And I'll just say that's just not the way it is. Sin is in the heart. Circumstances draw out what's already there, which means that just because you have a moral outlet for your lust does not mean that the lust problem in your heart is going to go away. So the question was, is it worth it? Should I break up with somebody? I think that's a wisdom call. You have to understand yourself. You need to talk to people and have some mentors help you with decisions like that. But I would say this, is that do not get married with somebody who is still struggling with out-of-control lust.
Yeah, that's good. Another one here for, you want to add on that, Alex? Or?
No.
Oh, for John. We see a couple different biblical themes, one of not filling up storehouses for ourselves on earth, but we also have, obviously in your talk, you talked a lot about the biblical idea of personal property. So how do we understand as young Christians and prepare for our future, whereas not making the earth our home permanently, but also investing wisely, saving up wisely? How do we walk that balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a nutshell, it's your intention and where your treasure is and where your heart is. So if you're building your little empire, here we use that example of someone who was building his empire and his barns and so forth, and that he was just going to let live and without Christ, and then of course that's a sin and that's a misallocation of capital. So it depends where your heart is. I think that too many people, though, Christians, don't think that investing is important. And I think putting aside capital, investing in businesses, investing in yourself, investing in the church, these are all long-term endeavors that we should be doing. We should be the owners of capital and productive businesses, places where we can hire people and so forth. So it gets really down to the motivation in one's heart. If you're just doing it for your own kingdom and it's just for your own purposes and not for the Lord, clearly that's a sin and that's incorrect. So when I'm talking about investing, I'm talking about investing from a Christian perspective into institutions that are going to be long-lasting, into businesses that are going to create products and services that are going to help people and further the economy and economics. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think the Bible, of all people, Christians should be more risk-taking because we understand the God who controls the world that we're in. And of course, I'm using risk and calculated risk but not running around fearful. We should start businesses. We should start. It's great to see schools start. We should start. Maybe we have to do some hospitals again if we can do private care. We should be plumbers and electricians and in the trades and so forth. This is not putting treasure in heaven. This is about building the kingdom of God and being a good steward of that capital while we're here and investing in the future.
Yeah, that's good.
I was just going to add that the Bible commands you to leave an inheritance for your children. And so your children and grandchildren should be blessed by the way in which you interacted in the world. And so leaving them an inheritance is not storing up storehouses for yourself. It's creating an inheritance for your children, which we're commanded to do biblically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Another relational question. This is coming from a woman's perspective. They say, is it wrong if I wait for a man to approach me first if I'm interested in a relationship?
No, I mean, well, okay, so what I've said to my daughters and what I think my wife has said, because my wife and I have talked about this because she disciples young women, counsels young women, is it is important for men to be initiators. Okay, it is important for men to be initiators. Men should be the ones asking the question. Men should be the ones making that first obvious move. But my advice to young women is that men are a little bit obtuse, and sometimes they need some signals, right? Like you're 19, 20, you've never maybe dated, you're a guy, you want to be an initiator, but it is a fearful thing to look into the eyes of a girl that you like and to potentially have her crush you, right? So it's much more helpful if, maybe in the church foyer there's been a series of conversations and she's actually stuck with the conversation. It's much more helpful if maybe she's sent you, this is for your generation, didn't work for Susie and I because it didn't exist, a text message. If you don't mind me kind of outing my daughter, who's married to Daniel. She married way down, by the way. But he did provide me with my first grandson, so that's good. I appreciate him for that. No, he's a man of God, and I trust him with the spiritual oversight of my daughter. But my daughter Casey is naturally a fairly quiet, reserved person. She's not like emotional. She doesn't have a lot of emotional highs and lows. At least doesn't manifest that. But she told me, like when she saw Daniel baptized a few years ago, she sent him like some sort of a congratulations text or I appreciated your testimony kind of text. And I think that was a strategic move in hindsight. As I understand it, it sort of signaled to him that she'd noticed him, right? So she didn't ask him out, but it's helpful for young women to know that guys sometimes need a little bit of a, even if it's very small, a little bit of a green light from you. Just gives them a little more comfort. So that doesn't mean you go ask the guy, but show a bit of interest. And another critical error, by the way, that women make is they roam through the churches or the Bible colleges or the places where Christian men meet Christian women in pairs and in triplets and in gangs. And it's almost impossible for a guy to like break in and ask and have any, one-on-one time with her. I remember when I was in Bible college and I was kind of checking out my wife. I'm like, please get away from your friends. I just want to be able to ask this girl out, but she's always with her crew. So it doesn't mean you can't be with, your girlfriends in church, but just very practical, strategic advice. Sometimes separating yourself from your girlfriends and actually just being comfortable having a one-on-one conversation with a guy in the church is not a bad idea. So that's hopefully some helpful advice for you.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have a little bit of time left, so I want to rapid fire through a few questions. The first is, Alex, do you want to give us your best pickup line that you used on your wife? That's the one that we...
To be honest, it's funny you ask, I have a disdain for pickup lines. So
Perfect.
I find men who rely on pickup lines are so deficient in so many ways.
You got that?
And
Is your answer.
I never actually wanted to be with a woman, I'm being very serious, who would give me a shot based on a pickup line. So I'm just like, if that actually works, and I always had this in high school and everything, I'm like, guys who practice words to get to women, like if that actually works, I don't want to marry that woman. So I smiled at her, and that's about it.
A good dentist.
Well, I'm much more shallow. So one of mine would be, if you could just hold this mic. I didn't just inherit the last name. That'd be good. That's my best one. Yeah, it was an Instagram. It depends on your personality. I like to joke around and goof around. And when I was dating my wife, you never want to be cheesy and think it's not cheesy, but it's okay to be cheesy if you know it's cheesy. So one time I bought her, when I was just kind of getting to know her, I bought her an apple fritter because I heard she liked them, and I put it in her mailbox at school, and I wrote on there, something sweet for someone sweet. It's super cheesy, but it worked.
That's funny. I don't know if this is something you can even answer quickly, John, or if this is something that would be for a different time, but some people are messaging most of their portfolios are ETFs. So is there a biblical ETF that they can look up later? Or is it just, you know what, you're on your own?
Well, see, this is the problem. People have just outsourced their money management to a limited number of companies that control all this wealth now. So you don't complain if your money is in the hands of some real criminals and crooks, because that's exactly what it is. If it's in BlackRock or Vanguard and Larry Fink and these characters, these are evil people, and you've given them the voting rights on your money. So I think you do need to get it out, start owning individual securities, find other options. They just dominate the whole market. I will add the last question in terms of date. One of the things I always wanted to do within the first couple of dates, taking a woman out, is I always had to get her to go out boating, okay? Because I figured I would never marry someone if she didn't like the water. I joke about this all the time. But they have to like the water. They have to have a good stomach for the waves and the ocean. So, and I found that in my dear wife. And so one of the things was a prerequisite that they had to like the outdoors and enjoy that. But and one thing Aaron said also about women, I would not be married to my wife if she didn't make herself pleasantly available. So in other words, she was very accommodating, and that caught my attention. So I think what Aaron's saying, that if you're interested in someone, just be friendly and make it easy for the person. I wasn't really looking at Heidi as much, and she was just so pleasant, and she made herself available and endeared herself, and it made it easy to take her out. And here we are 30 years later. So that does work. It's good advice.
Yeah, oh, that's good. Dating non-Christians. Yeah, you guys want to?
No.
Okay, easy. What else do we got here? How much of a role should parents have in the say of their children's relationships? If you're dating someone or want to date someone and their parents are like, you know what, they got to finish university or they got to be out of the house or...
Well, we're in the thick of this because our kids are 18 to 25 this year. 3 of them are married. The 4th will be married in July. So our basic idea was we're totally fine with you getting married when you become an adult. And the intense aspect of our parenting job is done when you're an adult. So when you're an adult, we're actually going to treat you like an adult. So when you're 18, living in our house becomes a total privilege. There's no obligation for me to have you live in my house. You're 18. If I've done my job well, when you're 18, you're an adult. You can steward all the major aspects of your life at 18. That's the mindset that we need to put into practice as parents. In the old days, and the old days weren't that long ago, we know the stories. 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old men went to war, defended their country. But we've delayed that. It's like, well, you're 25, you should probably get a job now, right? Kind of a mindset. So raising kids towards adulthood is really, really important, discipling them in Christ. So the only real controls we put in place is we said, you can't date till you're 17. The reason for that is because that's 1 year to 18. So potentially you could get married at 18. There's no point in dating at 16 or 15. What's the point of that? That's a long run to adulthood. Do not date indiscriminately. If you're not dating to get married, don't date. We don't agree with that. It should always be strategic. If you're not ready to get married within a year from now, you shouldn't be dating. That's what I told my kids. Why would you want to be dating someone for 5, 6, 7, 8 years? Why would you be dating someone at 18 if your plan is to go finish 8 years of education and then get married? You're putting yourself in sexual temptation. You're delaying the dynamics of how relationships develop. So our rule of thumb is, if you believe you're marriable at 18, start dating at 17. If you don't want to get married till you're 25, start dating at 24. But don't date before that. There's no reason for it. And then obviously, Christians, but not just Christians. Okay, there's a lot of Christians around, Growing Christians, mature Christians, people that serve in the church, people that have their heads screwed on. They don't need to come from the best family ever, but they themselves need to have a core to them, quality people, love Christ. You can see that very early on in people. So if it's a person that flakes in and out of church, church hops and pew shops, isn't really committed to Christ, stay away from them. And, so far we have 4 out of 4 good choices that our kids have made. But we didn't control personalities. I remember talking to an older couple probably 10 years ago, and they said to me, and I'm not sure we really think much about this, but if I were to guess who my kids would marry, I wouldn't have thought it would be that person. They weren't saying that in a negative way. It's just that I think with all 4 of my kids, it's been, I guess that wasn't on my mind, but it's great. So don't have the, don't tell you, I remember a parent many years ago said to her son, you have to date a blonde girl. I've always wanted a blonde daughter-in-law, and she has to be blonde. Well, the guy he's still not married to the best of my knowledge. So don't put expectations on people in those irrelevant, unnecessary areas, but just help them to understand the nature of marriage, the absolute necessity for the person to be a growing Christian, and then let your children make the decisions that they need to make, and don't control that, and don't micromanage those decisions.
Yeah. I don't know if that guy is still here, but there's some good hairstylists that could dye hair any color blonde. So,
no, he is not on the list.
The only thing I would add to that is that, particularly if you're a guy and you're dating a girl whose family is a Christian family, right? She has a godly father. I mean, I'm not talking about perfection. I'm just talking about girls, you don't want to date somebody who minimizes the authority of your father, or disrespects or dishonors your parents or the household rules. Because somebody who would do that is, number one, not honoring you and the family that God has given to you. But it also just shows a flawed view that they have of families and parental authority in the first place. There's a crack in the foundation that's now expressing itself through their disdain for your family or your parents. So I'd be very, very wary of a guy or a girl who was willy-nilly about the godly parental authorities of the other.
Yeah, and just to be very practical, one of the things I teach the young men in our church, and I've expected it of the young men that have expressed an interest in my oldest daughter, is you can take a girl out 3 times. After that, you have to ask her dad for his blessing and permission. That's honorable. Because 3 times you're just kind of getting to know each other. You're having coffee, just trying to figure it out. But I would expect that a young Christian man in our church, if he's taking one of the young Christian ladies out in our church, by the 3rd date, would just go and say to her dad, hey, I just want to let you know I'm interested in your daughter. Are you okay if I court her or date her? That sets the relationship up. It says this guy's serious. He's not a coward. He has some initiative. And, if the relationship moves forward, you're going to have to ask her dad for permission to marry her anyway. Which, by the way, is really important. Ask the dad. Don't ask the mom. When you walk down the aisle and the question is asked, who gives this woman to be married to this man? The dad doesn't say her mother and I, because her mother and I aren't the spiritual heads. He says, I do. He's the spiritual head. Whenever I do weddings, I just forbid guys from saying that. And if they insist on it, that I change the question, who gives their blessing? Because the husband is the one. The dude's not walking down the aisle. You notice that even at secular weddings? He's not coming down the aisle. She's coming down the aisle to be presented to her new spiritual head. So the father is asked, who gives this woman to be married to this man? And he says, as a man, I do. That's the way it's supposed to work.
That's good. And one more question. I don't know if, Alex, you want to start us off with this. Maybe you guys can all hit on this as we close. I know we've heard from you guys publicly in the past couple of years. We've had some great messages today, hearing about your courage and your boldness for Christ. Is it wrong to be reserved as a Christian man? Do you need to be outgoing necessarily to be bold and courageous? Or is that something you should try and push back against?
Scripture tells us to open our mouth for the oppressed. And while taking into account a variety of gifts, a variety of vocations and callings. Certainly not every man will be as eloquent as the next. Certainly every man will not have the gift of speaking, which will probably manifest itself publicly. But every single man should be active and not passive in their advocacy for oppressed people. And so one of my, I think the indictments on a lot of men in our country is that they went along with injustice against their neighbors, against the elderly, against children, because it was just costly for them to say something. So no, I don't think it's wrong for a man to be reserved, but you don't need to be, Martin Luther in order to open your mouth. Opening your mouth is as simple as at your dinner table or with your group of friends or with your coworkers, that you are not the kind of guy who self-censors because of the fear of shame. Guys are totally cowed and castrated by shame. That I am certain that 90% of men would rather be punched in the face. I've been punched in the face. It's not bad. Like
We noticed.
actually, like I spent, what's that?
We noticed.
Yeah. I actually was thinking afterwards, that wasn't that bad. Like I was waiting for it to be bad and it just wasn't. And he was a big guy. But what I definitely did fear is shame. Public shaming. You're a bad person. You're a bad man. And this is what tons of men fear.
Yep.
So I think that we ought to push against the self-censorship. We ought to open our voice to tell the truth, whether it's just to our siblings, whether it's to our buddies, whether it's to our employer, whether it's wherever it is that the Lord has us. We can speak.
That's good.
I would just say that courage and masculinity is something that's cultivated. It's not necessarily that comes natural to fallen man. I would say I'm introverted. I would say that courage and everything did not come naturally to me. I didn't have a whole lot of role models in my life that modeled to me what biblical masculinity, assertiveness, initiative, courage looked like. So I would say that growing up in my teenage years, I played sports and stuff. I was a dude still, but I would say that the sort of masculine qualities of courage, bearing responsibility, being protective of the people around you is not something that came naturally to me. And so you surround yourself with people that you want to emulate, and then you begin to do things that scare you. Doing hard things is something that I think too few young people do nowadays. Do hard things, and God molds and shapes you through that. And so I would just say, be obedient to Scripture, and it gets easier. Long obedience in the same direction creates godly character to the point where it does come more naturally the more you cultivate it. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So I love my dad. He's still alive. I've completely forgiven him. I have no bitterness or anger toward him at all. But he did abandon me when I was 10 years old, and my 5 brothers and sisters. So I was raised in a single parent home, squished between 2 very dominant sisters. And then I have 3 brothers that came after that. So one might think, well, that guy's jinxed. He's never going to figure out how to be a good husband or a good spiritual leader. His dad's not around. He's squished between 2 girls. We were kind of in some quasi-dysfunctional churches in hindsight. But you're not jinxed because of your past. You're not jinxed because of your dad's example or lack of example. You're not jinxed depending on your birth order. If you have a basic desire to grow in wisdom, and by the way, I remember distinctly as a kid reading Proverbs, I was reading through the Old Testament, and I came to the point where Solomon's about to be coronated, and he asks for wisdom. Remember that? And I thought, well, maybe I should ask for that too. I don't need to be the wisest guy that ever lived, but I just prayed, Lord, make me wise. And I think he has beyond my natural capacity. beyond my upbringing, beyond the churches that he saw fit to put me in. And so this is a gift. If you don't have it, pray for it. And let God give it to you. And if God gives it to you, guess who gets the credit for it? God gets the credit for it. So you can pray for things you don't naturally have. You can pray for wisdom. You can pray for heightened relational skills, which is about manifestation of wisdom in part. And then, of course, generally, the Bible also says he who associates with wise men will be wise. So be careful who you associate with. So what I did was I would look for guys, and we moved around a lot as kids, but I would look for men in the church that I respected. And I would just go chat with them. And one of them owned a plumbing company, and he employed me as a plumber. So I worked for him for 4 summers, and all his sons. And they just helped me to become more comfortable being a man in the absence of having older brothers, in the absence of a dad. So there's praying for wisdom is important. Praying that the Lord would help you to overcome your deficits. I think the Lord will bless that. If those are godly requests, why would he not want to make you more relational if that's a struggle, if you're going to use it for his honor and glory? Why would he not want to make you wise? And then associating with people who have the pluses to your minuses, which is really, really important. By the way, that's true in marriage. Don't marry someone that's just like you. That's boring. Marry someone that has strengths that you don't have. And presumably you'll have strengths that she doesn't have. So my wife and I are so different, but so compatible. And I'm so thankful for her in many ways. And, when I was a young man, we fell in love. We didn't really know too much about marriage at the time. But one thing I think I intuitively understood is that there was something about her that is very different than me that I needed, and vice versa. So that's just another example of where associating with people that aren't like you can help take you to the next level. And my wife's been a huge blessing in shaving off some of those sharp edges. Like, if you think I'm a jerk now, you should have seen me 30 years ago. So shaving off some of those sharp edges and just helping me to become more whole in Christ.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to add something to that, John.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I'd follow up just with what Aaron said. I was raised in an exceptionally good Christian home. I really couldn't have asked for better parents. But my father, both his parents were died by the time he was 11. And he was actually spent quite a bit of time in an orphanage in Kitchener. And so he really had no father figure, and a mother for that matter. And yet he was an outstanding father, and you would never know that. Fortunately, the orphanage that he was in was run by a lovely Christian lady who was never married, and she devoted her life to the kids. And she brought them all out to church. You could do this back in, I guess, the 40s. You'd be thrown in jail now if you did that. And that's where he got introduced to the gospel and to Christianity. And then the Lord saved him. And as Aaron said, he had great role models and people to follow, the scriptures. And so he was raised in a very deficient background and turned out to be one of the best fathers you possibly could have, a godly man. He was a chiropractor, served many, many people for many years. And so you're not going to be held hostage to your background if you're a Christian. God changes you. He gives you many examples, gives you the biblical understanding of that. And that can make all the world a difference. And what a blessing. I just look forward to seeing my dad. He passed away back in 2017, but I'll see him in glory. And what a great father he was. He was a great example and certainly pointed all his boys to Christ. And he was a leader in the home and so forth. So, and you mentioned just the last thing I'd say is there are some Christians that are much more reserved, as you said, but they draw the lines. They're faithful and obedient to Christ. And so the different personalities and temperaments, and I've known individuals who are powerful Christians, but they're a little more reserved. They're not out front yelling and saying all sorts of things and maybe out preaching and that, but you see it in their life, and their life is different, and that's their witness and testimony.
Yeah.
One of the beauties of leaving and cleaving is that you get to hit the reset button. So you can learn from your past, but you're not subject to your past. So when you leave and cleave, every generation has the opportunity to leave and hit the reset button. And by the way, this is why culture can actually be transformed very quickly if we get the young people to think clearly about marriage. Every one of you, regardless of the homes you grew up in, good or bad or somewhere in between, when you get married, you can hit the reset button, anchor your marriage on Christ, and be a huge blessing to your children. And when you are, remind them how much of a blessing that is to be raised in a Christian home and to pass it on to the next generation.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for this biblical wisdom. Let's give a round of applause to these guys.